Hey everyone, Rho here. Before we begin today, next week we kick off our next week special, part 2 of the reward for hitting the big 100k subs. Now I was very tempted for a Lorgar or Vulcan week, but I've decided to focus on the Great Crusade and Heresy years of Roboute Guilliman. We've spoken about him a lot within the current timeline, but I really want to try and dive into the moulding of his character, how he became the Primarch and man we see before us today. So next week we'll be discussing the big man in blue. And with that in mind, today I wanted to get in the spirit of things by discussing his infamous Dauntless Few. General spoiler warning to begin, as today we will be discussing events from across the Warhammer 40k universe, so you have been warned. But with that said, let's just jump straight in. Now, being located out upon the far galactic east of the galaxy, Guilliman and the Ultramarines were oblivious to the events and betrayal of Istvan, and it was within the Calf system that they would find their first taste of betrayal. And those events are covered in the Horus Heresy novel Know No Fear by Dan Abnett. Horus, as War Master, ordered Guilliman to assemble his legion in preparation for a campaign against the Orcs. Alongside him was to be Lorgar and his word-bearers, the only real legion that rivaled Guilliman's in size. Now we'll dive into these specific events more next week. However, as it was, the tale of Lorgar and the word-bearers' betrayal is well known, catching Guilliman and his legion completely by surprise. And it was here during this outbreak of treachery that Lorgar informed his brother of the loss of his loyal brothers upon Istvan, namely Corax, Ferrus Manus, and Vulcan. The interaction itself takes place in the heat of the action, so there's little time for Guilliman to process this revelation. However, later, in a moment of relative peace, Guilliman reflects on the loss of these brothers. And this is where the notion of the Dauntless Few arises. Guilliman laments that he will miss Corax and Vulcan greatly, but that he would miss Ferrus Manus most of all. Which in itself is a bit of a surprise, considering Ferrus didn't particularly like Guilliman. However, this novel was written very early in the Heresy series, and we've obviously had a lot more stories expanding the lore we know since then. However, after Guilliman has spoken these words, his first chapter master Marius Gage believes he knows why Guilliman feels this way, and it's because Ferrus was one of the brothers Guilliman referred to in his Dauntless Few. Now, the Dauntless Few are described as the brothers he can depend on to do what they were made to do. And that's a very important description. He's not saying that they're the best, he's saying he can depend on them the most. Which to me feels like they exemplify the role they were given by the Emperor the best. They do and are exactly what the Emperor intended. Guilliman feels that alongside any one of these brothers, he and his legion could win any war. Now, it's worth noting this is simply Guilliman's opinion, and in a way it is a bit contradictory, considering it's mentioned he admires Jagatai, but he isn't in the Dauntless Few because he's not predictable and thus trustworthy. Well, that is exactly the role Jagatai was made for, so that's really him exemplifying his role perfectly. So yeah, with that in mind, we do have to take Guilliman's reasoning here with a little pinch of salt. However, with that said, who were Guilliman's Dauntless Few? Well, thankfully they are all named. We have Rogal Dawn, Leman Russ, Sanguinius, and obviously Ferrus Manus. So why these brothers? Why not the others? Do they truly reflect their roles the best? Well, firstly, in giving us the reasons for Jaghatai and the White Scars not being included, not only does that lend us a huge portion of Guilliman's reasoning, but it also helps us immediately understand why other brothers were ruled out. Trust. In not being able to predict what Jaghatai would do, Guilliman couldn't truly trust what would occur alongside them in the battlefield. His legion couldn't plan how to adapt alongside them. And immediately for me, this gives an obvious reason for why many of his brothers were not included. The Lion is clearly one to fall into this category straight away. Renowned for his secrets and keeping himself apart, if Guilliman feels he doesn't truly know him, then he can't truly trust him. Alfarius would undoubtedly fall in here too. No one can say they know the Alpha Legion, let alone predict them. While that is them fulfilling their role, you can understand why Guilliman wouldn't select them. And especially so considering he and Alfarius had an infamously rocky relationship. Angron and the World Eaters, the overriding rage certainly makes them hugely unpredictable. And while you may say that's them fulfilling their role, we do know Angron was not intended to be a rage-fueled berserker. His psychic talent of absorbing other people's pain into himself really gives us a hint of a very different Primarch. To me, he may almost have been originally more akin to Vulcan. He is a broken Primarch. Angron and the World Eaters are not the Emperor's original vision. And that's something we'll definitely discuss again another day. Konrad Curze, I think, is an obvious one that falls very similar to Jaghatai in Guilliman's thinking. While he absolutely fulfills what the Emperor intended of him, Guilliman simply couldn't predict what he was going to do. Their way of warfare is very particular to say the least. You could even throw in Magnus here. For all of Magnus's level-headedness, I could easily see Guilliman finding Magnus's reliance on psychic power as hugely unpredictable. And there's been occasions where he's come into conflict with fellow legions in his desire to save ancient lore. When you think about it, it does make sense why Guilliman would not choose Magnus. And maybe this form of thinking could even be applied to Vulcan and Corax, albeit a bit more of a stretch. Vulcan and the Salamanders are well known for putting the lives of humanity above anything else, even if it means putting themselves in more danger to do so. As honourable as that may be, as much as it endears you to Vulcan, you can understand why it doesn't exactly help upon the battlefield. And thus you can understand why he doesn't make Guilliman's selection. Now Corax is a bit of an interesting one, as we know they had what appears to be a very fond relationship. However, I think it's the style of Corax's warfare that really rules him out of Guilliman's selection. He's really very similar to Curze, just without the massacres and murders. It's not necessarily the best style for another legion to try and complement. Now the four remaining brothers, however, Mortarion, Fulgrim, Perturabo and Lorgar, for me, I don't see any immediately obvious reasons to rule them out. They could almost be my anti-Dauntless Few. So why didn't these four make the cut? Mortarion's way of war is 100% predictable. In fact, it's a very similar, relentless grinding method of war employed by Ferrus. If you've got the Death Guard by your side, you know they are not going anywhere. To me, Mortarian's not an obvious one to rule out right away. In fact, the only real reason I can think of is maybe Guilliman feels like he doesn't truly know Mortarian. We know the Death Lord very much kept himself to himself, a bit like Lion L. Johnson, except maybe not quite as extreme. So maybe it's just that simple lack of understanding by Guilliman. However, still on the battlefield, I would have thought Mortarian is maybe one of the most predictable of all his brothers. Now, Fulgrim is a tough one for me. I know since his ascension to demonhood he's lost a bit of that shine as the heresies progressed. However, there was a time back in the Crusade that Fulgrim was up there amongst his brothers as maybe the very best duelist. When I think of the Emperor's children, I don't think of them being particularly unknowable or unpredictable. Maybe it's Fulgrim's penchant for a glorious victory, or that desire for perfection leading to some rash decisions. Maybe it's simply because the Emperor's children was a fairly small legion, or maybe it's a simple dislike in Fulgrim's personality. Now, the Lord of Iron Perturabo, I see no reason why he shouldn't have been considered. There's not much in the lore regarding their relationship, so that one is still a bit of an unknown. However, you'd expect some manner of kinship between them considering their similarities. Guilliman does reflect on Perturabo as a bit of a warmonger in Know No Fear. However, he labels Russ the same, and he is in the Dauntless Few. So we can't rule out Perturabo for that. And for all the Lord of Iron's harshness or even grumpiness at times, you can't really label Perturabo as a secretive or even aloof brother. We've glimpsed him having a real fond relationship with Magnus throughout the Crusade and the Heresy. The label just doesn't apply to me for Perturabo. Guilliman's reasonings for Ferrus were that he was unshakable, that if he were by your side he would never break. Well, you change that to the Lord of Iron by your side and honestly the description fits just as well. He was the Emperor's Lord of Iron for a reason. If anything, I dare say Perturabo would be more predictable than Ferrus on the battlefield. The Gorgon did have a famous temper, one that could very well get the better of him. Honestly, for me, of all the Primarchs who did not make the cut, Perturabo is the one I just don't see any reasons why not. Maybe drop your thoughts why Perturabo isn't in Guilliman's Dauntless Few below. Is it a simple case of him preferring other brothers? And lastly, Lorgar. Obviously their relationship was never the best, to say the least after Monarchia. But the Wordbearers aren't exactly renownedly unpredictable or untrustworthy. And yes, obviously we're talking before Calth. Maybe it's the fact that before Monarchia they simply didn't have a great record. However, that was more than made up for in the years that followed. If I remember right, Lorgar and the Wordbearers actually had the best record after Monarchia. For me, I think this could be a simple case of dislike. Lorgar was religious, viewing their father as a god. Guilliman simply did not. Either way, it's an interesting one to consider. But that leaves us with the Chosen Four. Ferrus, as we just discussed, we know was chosen for his unshakableness and sheer resolve, and in fact was Guilliman's preferred choice of all of them. You can see the Iron Hands easily taking on the defensive responsibility, or the sheer grinding assault. So it would give Guilliman and the Ultramarines a good flexibility. Rogel, you would have to say, would fall into the same kind of boat here in regards to his resolve. If you've got the Imperial Fists lining up alongside you, then you know you don't have much to worry about. In this scenario, you would assume Guilliman would be taking the more offensive role. And then the opposite to the grinding unshakableness of the iron hands and fists, you have the assault and offensive orientated Blood Angels and Space Wolves. Here it's undoubtable the Ultramarines themselves would form the more defensive role, with Russ and Sanguinius the ones taking the fight to the heart of the enemy. For all the reputations of both of these Primarchs being furious in the heat of battle, they are also well renowned for keeping to their tactics. Russ attempted to teach this lesson to his brother Angron, and in regards to Sanguinius, we've seen this play out before our very eyes within the siege. Guilliman could be completely confident of both of these Primarchs fulfilling their roles as they had agreed. And so yeah, I can understand why Guilliman chose the Primarchs that he did. When you really think of the ones who he didn't, you can understand the reasons why. Now admittedly a few maybe are a little more in the grey area, such as Mortarion and Fulgrim for me, but again the only one I just can't think of a reason for absolutely has to be the Lord of Iron Perturabo. Honestly, I really think we need to get some respect back on that guy's name. But as always guys, what do you think? Why do you think Guilliman chose the brothers he did for his Dauntless Few? And why do you think the ones who didn't make it were left out? Do you think like me there's no real reason Perturabo did not make the cut? Or do you see other brothers as viable replacements? And if you were to choose your own Dauntless Few for your preferred legion, then who would you select? As always, leave your thoughts in the comments below, I love to read them. Huge thank you to all my subscribers, your support truly means a lot to me, it really does. And if you're new, please consider subscribing to help the channel grow. If you enjoyed this particular vid, then why not drop a like on it too? But with that said, I am off, and I'll see you all again real soon.